Childhood has been stolen by technology companies. By 2021, just about 1/3 of teen girls had major depression. So we want to delay until age 14 to give kids a smartphone.
And we are calling it iPhone.
Hello and welcome to Tell Me More, the first English-speaking talk of Germany's news weekly Die Zeit. My name is Jochen Wittner. I'm the London correspondent of Die Zeit. And what I want to do here is to give space to highly interesting people from the Anglosphere who I think should be heard by a wider audience, including maybe also some English-speaking Germans. And my first guest is Zach Rausch, a researcher at New York University, where he worked on the effects of smartphone use on the mental health of young people. Now, when I came across some of Zach's findings a couple of days ago, I could hardly believe my eyes. We show you a graph here, which shows an incredible rise in depression rates among teenagers in America, beginning in the year 2010. Now, what you see here has happened all across the Anglosphere, so also in the UK, also in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And according to Zach, we are in the midst of what he calls international mental illness epidemic. What is happening? We will talk about this in a minute, but first, Zach, good morning to you in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Tell us a bit about yourself first. Why are you doing what you are doing? And how did you come to deal with the issue we want to talk about today? And what is the story behind the graph that we just saw?
So, Jochen, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about my work. So my story really begins when I was in graduate school, but my story to that point, I think, is important to understand how I got to studying adolescent mental health and why it matters so much to me. So when I was 18 years old, I was traveling through South America, and I was, during that time, I was actually unknowingly drugged. And that set off a decade of really intense and extreme anxiety and depression, and I really struggled for a long time. And then I actually got into working in wilderness therapy later on in my 20s. And
what is wilderness
really
therapy? Sorry to interrupt. What is wilderness therapy?
It was in Connecticut in the United States, where I would work with one or two other people around my age, and we'd take out kids from the foster care system and from other struggling youth, and we'd take them backpacking, rock climbing, canoeing for 3 weeks out in the wilderness. And that transformed my life completely. And it was those two experiences, this drug-induced anxiety and depression and years of struggle, into this kind of moving away from modern life and into the wilderness. And those two experiences really were very seminal to my identity and how it formed. And then that led me, as I went to graduate school, I studied psychology, research in psychology, and I came across Jonathan Haidt's recent book at the time in 2018, The Coddling of the American Mind. And the book is all about the collapse of mental health among college students in the United States. And so I felt like I fit right in. And I decided to do some research on his book because I found it so interesting. And that's how I connected with John.
We should point out, actually, that Jonathan Haidt, who you're working with now as a lead researcher, he's about to publish a new book by the end of March called The Anxious Generation, which will focus on exactly the issue we're talking about.
And then as I started to work with him, he assigned me the task to figure out what was happening outside of the United States. And what I found and what I will talk about is it wasn't just college students. This was happening among adolescents 10 to 19 years old. And it began in the early 2010s, and it happened in all across the Anglosphere, across the Nordic regions, in Europe as well. And our argument is that there really has been an international collapse in youth mental health. And we believe that it is driven by what we call overprotection in the real world and underprotection online. And it's those two forces that have really driven this crisis.
If you look at the rates, the spike in mental health issues that young people suffer from in the West, that's enormous. I mean, you have basically more than a doubling of anxiety disorders in the West, and just to exclude other possible explanations there, like have you looked at other possible explanations apart from smartphone use that could be behind this enormous spike?
Yeah, so let me give us a little bit of a benchmark, baseline understanding of these trends a little bit more. So you're right. Since 2010 in the United States, there's been a doubling, more than a doubling, of major depressive episodes in the last year. And by 2021, just about 1/3 of teen girls had major depression. So,
what 1/3 of teenage girls have
just about
had major
it's a little
depression?
under. It's just about 30%, 31% or so. And so it's become a normal part of American adolescence to experience this. Now, it's not just major depression, right? So we talk about anxiety. It's also where there has been a tripling of emergency department visits for self-harm episodes among girls 10 to 14 years old, and a doubling for the 15 to 19-year-olds. And suicide rates are also up. And all of up for the youngest group, it's over 100% increase since 2010. And all of this happened right around the same time, between the years of 2010 and 2015. And it's this exact period where in the US and then in a bunch of countries around the world, rates of all of these issues that I'm talking about start to spike. It's almost like there's an elbow in the curve. And so when we are thinking about the explanations for what has happened, I think I want to walk you through a little bit of my process with John of how we got to smartphones and social media. So let me tell the story of the causal chain that we believe points to the role of smartphones and social media in causing these problems. So when John and I began looking at the mental health data, we noticed that there was a pattern in the data, and that pattern was composed of 5 different parts. So the first is what I was talking about, which is that if you look at rates of depression, for example, in the United States before 2010, they were generally relatively stable. Girls were always a little higher than boys, but generally just minor fluctuations. And then right around 2010, you get this upswing. That's particularly sharp for girls. For boys, it's not quite as sharp, but it is rising very substantially. So that was the first thing, pre-2010, post-2010. The second thing that we noticed was that it hit girls harder than boys. This almost is like always the case, that since 2010, whatever happened hit girls very hard. Now, in terms of suicide, that's a little bit different, and causes of suicide are different, but girls harder than boys. The third is the type of disorders. So when we look at what's called internalizing issues, so depression, anxiety, self-harm, suicide, self-esteem, loneliness, all of those issues, it's oriented inwards towards the self. That is what has gotten worse. When we look at externalizing issues, more antisocial behavior, fighting, that actually has been going down. So what's happening is a very specific kind of problem is emerging. The fourth part of this pattern that we notice is that it didn't hit adults in any way like it hit this very specific group of people, the 10 to 19-year-olds and some young adults. So if you look, for example, at anxiety rates in the US, you get a huge surge for the youngest cohort and almost no change at all for those above the age of 50.
So it cannot be a cause that, let's say, for instance, the definition of what mental disorders are has changed in 2010, or that doctors or psychologists are more inclined to believe patients when they say they have mental issues. So there hasn't been a change like this, in other words.
To an extent, yes. Let me just say the last part of this pattern that we noted, which is that it's not just happening in the United States. This is happening in countries all around the world. And this is key. All of these factors are key to addressing these alternative explanations because, for one, even if there were some changes, for example, in the United States, in terms of norms around mental health, it doesn't explain why this happened in Iceland and why this happened in New Zealand, all at the same time, in the same exact way.
Right, and it wouldn't explain why it happens to young people in particular.
Right, and so it is the case that stigma around mental health issues has decreased. People are more willing to talk about it, but that's where it comes into this second piece. I talked about depression and anxiety, but when those are often self-report measures, more willingness to talk about things. When we look at behavioral measures, suicide, self-harm, actual hospitalizations for self-harm, that cannot be explained by changing norms. That is especially when we see there's actually hospitalizations, the most extreme, version of self-harm. That has actually, for 10 to 14-year-old girls in the United States, that has increased by over 500%.
500% more hospitalizations.
A 500% increase. So the amount, and what's real in the United States, we have this problem of bedding, that there's not enough beds for kids in hospitals. And what ends up happening is kids get what it's called boarding. They get stuck in the emergency room for weeks because they don't have somewhere to go. So all of this is reflective of an actual change that is happening to young people, that they are experiencing much more distress than they did just a decade before.
So, Zach, how do you explain this? What happened in the years prior to 2010? So
the story that we have come to understand about this time period is that childhood as a whole transformed almost entirely from one that was before 2010 primarily what we called play-based, and it turned into one that was primarily phone-based. And so if you were born before the 1980s, you typically had a childhood in the United States and in many countries where you are outside, you are with other kids, you are playing, you're often unsupervised, you're with a mixed age groups, and this is how we learned to develop competency and skills and social relationships and emotional strength and all of these really essential components of child development. And then we replaced all of that, almost all of that, with screens, where everything's now mediated through smartphones that are not designed to foster healthy human relationships. They're designed to keep you on screens, on devices, and not always for your own well-being. And so it's this transition from play-based to phone-based that is our core hypothesis. And I can walk you through some of the major changes in technology to show just how different things have become, and then some of the specific mechanisms through which we believe smartphones and social media are driving these problems.
If I remember correctly, the iPhone hit the market in 2007, correct?
Correct. So iPhone comes out in 2007.
And we are calling it iPhone.
And even before that, right, you had different social media platforms that people were using, Facebook, and there were a couple before that, MySpace. But what was happening before the iPhone is that people could access social media platforms, but there was often happening on a desktop computer, on a laptop in your home. You couldn't bring it around everywhere you went. So in 2007, when the smartphone comes in, that is really a key point of change. But it's not, things don't start in 2007. And so part of the reason is that the smartphone initially was quite simple. You had access to the internet, you can call people, you had email, but you didn't have an app store where you can download these third-party apps. That comes in 2008. So then you start having companies competing with each other to create extremely engaging and addictive applications where now you can start downloading different social media apps directly onto your phone. And so then in 2009, we start to see the effects of this. You get the push notification in 2009, so you start getting notified throughout the day. And so you get all of these pings, which is equivalent to Pavlovian like behaviorist psychology of starting to associate and develop dependency on your device. So you get push notifications.
Oh, so this sounds like the invention of fire in the field of human communications. I mean, this is the point where no matter where you are, you can be addressed by an infinite number of people, and you can communicate with an infinite number of people on a steady basis, just carrying your smartphone device.
Absolutely. And not only that, it changed the nature of human relationships. So we can communicate with more people. But what also happened in 2009 is that social media became much more hyper-viral. You get the like button in 2009, the retweet button, and all of this turns social media from being a social networking platform system into a social platforming system, where now it's less about communicating one-on-one it wasn't always like that, but into something where you are platforming yourself for an audience and for that audience to judge you. And that's really what changed.
On the front, we have a front-facing camera. We have the receiver. We have the home button.
And so in 2010, you get the front-facing camera. And you also get the first social media app designed for the smartphone, which was Instagram. In 2012, Instagram is bought by Facebook and the user base surges. And this is really where you start getting a ton of teenagers online all the time, every day, on Instagram, on these platforms, posting and platforming themselves to be judged by strangers, by friends, and you're developing this 24/7 companion in your pocket that is defining your self-worth.
Right. So this is, I think, an extremely important point in the word you used, that communication has become universal, but not only communication, but being judged upon. It really made me shriek a bit when you used the word to be judged. So that means that in some way or the other, your smartphone becomes a kind of external conscience for teenagers, or how would you describe this?
I think you're totally right that it is a form of consciousness that's always with us and always looking at us. And what I want to kind of point us to is a bigger picture around what human childhood and adolescence is all about. One of the key features of our evolutionary history is that we were given 10 years of childhood where we don't really grow that much. Our brains are at full size by the age of 6, and then we kind of like halt for a while before we keep growing, and then we start growing at puberty. And one of the key aspects of this period is that we do a lot of play, and a lot of that play is very low cost. So we make a lot of mistakes. We try a lot of things, but the harm and the permanence of our mistakes are very temporary, very small. When we move into this digital world, now it's not only that things are permanent. So I say something, and this could last for years. It's also being judged by hundreds of people. So every action that we take has a feeling of much higher cost. And that really distorts this process of child development where, we have to make mistakes and learn things and develop over time. And we've moved into this virtual world that's very high cost, very stressful, and it's hard to develop those kind of skills that we need.
That is sadly fascinating. So in other words, there is no real childhood in the digital world because the consequences are the opposite of playful. They can really harm teenagers.
That's 100% right. Childhood has been stolen. Childhood has been stolen by technology companies. And at the same time, childhood has also been taken away by, in many parts of the United States, also by this rising overprotection in the real world. And so this is the second part of the story, is that on the one hand, since the 1980s or so, especially in the United States, we started having kids be over-supervised. They couldn't go out on their own. And this started happening at older and older ages. And kids were staying home in the house. And that was for a variety of different reasons. But so they're not having the experiences that they need playing on their own, out with their friends. And at the same time, we're now replacing this with what seemed like a safer option because the kids are in the home, is these devices. And what's true about both of these is that they're experience blockers. They're preventing kids from having the experiences that they need in order to thrive and grow and to have the childhood that most of us who were born before the 1980s or so really had for most of human history.
So you had, let's say, helicopter parenting in the real world and submarine parenting when it came to the digital world.
Right. And what's important is that it's not any parent's fault. It's about the incentives and the social dynamics around us. So it's all about a big piece of this is just technological change. And it happened very rapidly.
Can you give an example, Zach, for how psychological harm is done to kids in the internet, on Twitter, on X, on Facebook? Can you give a concrete example what children might see, how they might be judged, and how this might affect their mental health?
Yeah, so I just read a fascinating statistic by, I hope I get his name right, Arturo Bejar. He was a senior, he worked at Facebook, and he gave testimony. And he was talking about Instagram, and one of the things he said is,
what I saw and all of our friends saw is that unwanted sexual advances and harassment, they happen all of the time. And they can't get help, though Instagram is right there and could help. They couldn't get help.
13% of children between 13 to 15 had gotten some sort of sexual solicitation within the last 7 days. So it just gives you a sense of what we're dealing with, which is that the quantity of exposure to harmful content, to cyberbullying, to predation is extremely high. And this is something that is extremely hard to moderate and manage. And we've kind of assumed that we have this sense that there should be no age on social media, kind of everybody's the same age. And we kind of just throw everybody into one big pot. And, if you think about TikTok and the way that, we post videos, young girls post videos of themselves dancing and having fun, but at the same time, you're having thousands of strangers who are saving and downloading those videos to their computers. So there's all sorts of ways that these dynamics and these platforms are just not suitable for young kids.
And then I guess there is a steady flow of bad news, horrendous pictures that young minds find it difficult to deal with. I mean, if I look down on my own childhood, I can remember that when I was about 10 or 12 years old, and of course I grew up without any smartphone, without internet, but my big anxiety back then was sparked by a movie called The Day After, which depicted what would happen after a nuclear war. And I can remember to this day that I was scared. I was afraid of nuclear annihilation. But then again, I wasn't bombarded with this all the time. It was just, a couple of weeks. I forgot about it. I regressed that, and that was that. But I guess today, due to the algorithms on the social networks, kids are drawn deeper and deeper into how dangerous the world is, how many wars there are, that we are all doomed because of climate change. So does this all also mean that there's no escape? There's no escape for kids from bad news or even apocalyptic news?
So this is a really important point, that what fuels almost all social media platforms is extreme content and outrage. Those are the ones that get the most traction and content. The most traction. And those are the ones that come up on our feed more and more. And so it's absolutely the case that young people are getting fed the most extreme content. So yes, they might be seeing events of terrorism or whatever it is on their feeds regularly, but they're also being fed a lot of their deepest insecurities. If you're a young girl concerned about your body image, you're being fed a lot of content around this, and they tend to get more and more extreme. And this can be seeing videos. I've seen one, for example, of a corpse bride diet, where you have an Instagram social media influencer who's posting content, of anorexia content for the most part. And so it's feeding it's not any individual's fault. It's an algorithmic style of feeding content that the platforms think that you want, but really it's just feeding in many aspects of life your deepest insecurities.
Wow. So you are saying that the algorithms have actually learned to read children's nightmares, or what children might perceive as very emotional, at least, and feed into this.
Absolutely. It feeds into, and it's just simply how it works, that the more outrageous the content, the more extreme it is, the more likely it is to go viral. And those are the incentives on these platforms, and that's the kind of content that is being shared. And what's so important is that it is particularly the most vulnerable kids. It are the kids that are already feeling bad about themselves, that are already having trouble in the home.
Right. But do you have any data on continental Europe so far?
So in terms of mental health data, what I have done is I spent the past 2 years or so really working on trying to understand what's happening internationally. And so when we look at, just to start with the Anglosphere, so Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, US, we see almost the same exact trends when it comes to anxiety, depression, and self-harm. And then when we look in the Nordic countries, the 5 major Nordic countries, we see it's different for suicide and self-harm, but when it comes to anxiety and depression, we're seeing the same exact trends there.
Wow, so we're talking about Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway?
Norway and Iceland, yep. And then when we kind of start going down into Europe, generally we're finding very similar trends. And more recently, I have found that it is specifically the most individualistic nations of Europe, more Protestant-based, so more of Northern Europe, that is seemingly having the largest changes in worse mental health over the last decade.
What would be the average screen time of a child in the West?
Yeah, that's a question.
How much time would they spend on their smartphones?
Yeah, I wish I brought this up earlier. The most recent 2023 Pew Research report on teen time online said that about half, 50% or so, are online almost all the time. So almost every waking hour.
What do you mean all the time when they're not sleeping? In other words, or not?
Right, every waking hour. And a variety of other studies confirm these general findings, where we're estimating between 8 to 10 hours a day on screens, often and this is for more entertainment purposes, not including school and other reasons of using screens. So it is consuming an inordinate...
But how is that possible, given that children of that age should spend a couple of hours in school every day? 10 hours on the smartphone? Upwards,
that is the max. It's generally, the average is between 7 and 9. And then depending on who we're looking at, it's more, and different days of the week, you'll have more and less screen time. But when it comes to social media, a recent Gallup poll found an average usage of about 5 hours on social media per day.
5 hours per day?
Yeah.
And we're talking about which age group?
So these are teens. So this is looking 13 to 17 years old. And it's not only that they're constantly using the devices, it's always on our minds. So another survey that recently came out found that kids get on average 237 notifications per day. We're constantly being pulled back into this world all throughout the day, 24/7. And this is what makes it different from other technologies. It's the fact that we have it with us in our pockets. We don't have the separation that we had with other technologies. And that's why this, we believe, has become so harmful.
Wow. Do you know what this reminds me of, actually? The sirens in Greek mythology, which are constantly trying and seducing our heroes from staying their course. So it sounds as if smartphones are sirening, in a way, the children away from their actual lives.
Yeah, that's really beautifully put.
Or horribly put.
Yeah.
What does that mean for children? I mean, time spent on screen cannot be spent in play, in real social interactions, right?
Exactly. This is one of the major issues here, is the opportunity cost. All of this time that's spent on these devices is time that's not spent doing the critical work of childhood, which is play. Play and interaction and building those skills that we really need. And for a variety of reasons, we do not believe that you're truly able to build those skills virtually. We evolved for the real world, and we need to have childhood in the real world in order to prepare ourselves to enter this digital world. And so maybe this can point maybe in a more positive direction into what we can do about this.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you about. Listening to you, a comparison springs to mind, which is if we look at toxic substances like alcohol and nicotine, which are banned for children, they are banned for a reason, because they impair the physical development of the children. And now you are telling us what we are seeing with social media in particular is that social media is impairing the psychological development of children. So wouldn't the suggestion be that, we would have to act on social media in a similar way that we act on nicotine and alcohol?
Yeah, there's there are people who disagree with John and myself, and people who don't see the evidence as quite as strongly as we do. But I and John, I believe, completely agree with you that we need to completely rethink the way that smartphones and social media interact in our lives. And one primary difference between cigarettes back in the day and social media today is that at least with cigarettes, kids could choose to opt out. Today, that's really not an option. And so a recent study just came out looking at, it was a remarkable study about what's called a collective action problem, where the researchers, it was a US survey of a couple thousand American college students, and they asked them, how much money would it take for you to get off of Instagram and TikTok for 1 month? And the answer, $50. You got to give me $50 in order to do this. Then they asked another question. They said, okay, how much money would you need to get off social media, TikTok and Instagram for 1 month if we got everybody else to do it too? And the answer to that question was, we're going to pay you to do that. And so what that story tells is that most kids and most young people feel trapped. They feel like they're stuck in this new social web and network. And actually, if they had true choice, they would get off of it. And so that's what we're facing. We're facing a collective action problem where we need to work collectively to create new norms, to recreate, to restore that play-based childhood that kids want, that parents want, that most people want.
What you just said, does that mean that there's actually, statistically, there's a cry of young people telling the adults, get us out of here?
In a variety of surveys, we're seeing this. So in Australia, for example, of over 4,000 12 to 24-year-olds, what is the number one reason for the mental health problems of your generation? Number one is social media. We're seeing this again and again. Very few young people are defending their phone-based childhoods, are defending smartphones and social media. The vast majority are actually starting to come together. There are a variety of nonprofits emerging from Gen Z, one called Log Off, another one Design It For Us, who are pushing back against tech companies. And what we believe is really important to do next is setting norms to delay smartphones. So the period that kids are most vulnerable is during puberty, especially early puberty. So we want to delay until age 14 to give kids a smartphone. And then social media is delaying to 16. So that gets you all the way through puberty for most people.
Right. Zach, your evidence appears absolutely compelling. Your political claims there, absolutely substantiated. But is there a chance for this? I mean, you can't disinvent or uninvent smartphones. They are there. And then you have this enormous peer pressure that you described. How would that technically, legally it would be quite easy to fix, I guess, just ban smartphones. But how does that work technically, practically in youth culture? What do you think?
Yeah, this is a great question. And this is, what we're currently working on. And again, what I think I want to emphasize is that talking to teachers and talking to parents, both groups are so sick of these devices and the way that it's infiltrated their relationships with their students and their kids, and it just creates so much conflict. There is so much of a drive and a desire for change. The problem is that most people feel hopeless, that there's nothing we can do. But just as an example, in the UK, just a couple of weeks ago, a group of two mothers started a WhatsApp group to talk about delaying smartphones. And now there are thousands of people, thousands of parents on that WhatsApp group. And so there's a deep hunger for this. And I believe that it is possible to do this from the ground up. And we can also get help from legislatively as well.
Zach, fascinating. We will stay tuned. We'll follow the story, certainly. And just as a reminder to our audience, the book coming out on which you were the lead researcher in New York University is called The Anxious Generation. And I think this might spark a real debate on how we go forward with the, I guess it's quite in your sense if I say that, with the toxicity of smartphone use.
Yeah. Jochen, thank you so much for having me on.
And we are calling it iPhone.